It was a Friday evening, and I was driving home after a long week. I couldn't wait to see Heather, my wife of 6 years. We didn't have kids, and our life together had been filled with laughter, good times, and those quiet, peaceful moments of just being in each other's company. Lately, though, things had changed. Heather had been distant. She still kissed me goodbye, but there was something mechanical about it. She had started going to the gym more often, working late more than usual, and there were even nights when she didn't come home until after midnight. I trusted her, or at least I tried to, but it was getting harder with every excuse she gave me that didn't seem to add up. Tonight, I wanted to surprise her. I picked up her favorite wine, got a bouquet of roses, and decided I'd cook dinner, something we hadn't done together in a while. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the house. Everything seemed normal from the outside, but the moment I stepped through the door, I sensed something was off. It was too quiet. Heather, I called, but there was no answer. Maybe she had gone for another late-night gym session. I set the roses on the table and walked through the house, but stopped cold as I saw it. A man's leather jacket, draped over the back of the couch. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard the faint sound of laughter coming from upstairs. My heart sank. It was her laugh, the one I hadn't heard in weeks. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, my body on autopilot, while my mind raced through the million possibilities of what was happening. My breath caught as I reached the top and saw the bedroom door slightly ajar, a soft, warm glow spilling out from inside. I pushed the door open just an inch, enough to see what I never thought I would. Heather, in bed, with another man. I couldn't move. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, the air leaving my lungs as my entire world came crashing down. The guy wasn't even trying to hide. He was lying there, casually, as if he owned the place. They didn't notice me standing there. Heather was too busy giggling at something he had said. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to burst in, to confront them both, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood frozen, feeling the rage, the hurt, the betrayal building inside me. How long had this been going on? Had it been happening right under my nose? Without a word, I turned and walked out of the house, the sound of their laughter echoing in my head. My whole life felt like a joke, and I was the punchline. That night, I slept in my car, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Heather over the past few months. All the late nights, the gym sessions, the work trips, it all made sense now. She had been cheating probably for months, and I'd been too blind to see it. The next morning, I drove back to the house. I needed answers, and I needed them now. When I walked in, Heather was sitting at the kitchen table, dressed in one of my old t-shirts, sipping coffee like it was just another Saturday morning. The jacket was gone, and so was the man. I stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to notice me. When she finally did, she smiled, but there was something hollow about it. "Morning, babe," she said casually. "Didn't hear you come in last night." I couldn't take it anymore. "Who was he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but she heard me. Her face drained of color, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she said, but her voice wavered. I stepped closer, my fists clenched at my sides. "Don't lie to me, Heather. I saw you. I saw him." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She just stared at me, frozen like a deer caught in headlights. Finally, she spoke. "It was a mistake," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "It didn't mean anything. I was lonely and—" "Lonely," I repeated, my voice shaking. "You were lonely? I've been here, Heather. I've always been here." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. But I didn't feel sorry for her. The anger and betrayal were too strong. This wasn't just some fling. This was the destruction of everything we had built together. "I'll pack my things," she muttered through her tears. But I stopped her. "No," I said, my voice cold. "I'll go. You can stay here with whoever." As I walked out the door, the bouquet of roses still sitting on the table, it hit me just how unfair it all was. I had given everything to this marriage, to her, and she had thrown it all away for some guy who didn't care. And now, I was the one leaving my own home, while she got to stay, her affair partner probably on his way over again. It wasn't just unfair. It was a nightmare. But it was my new reality, and I had no choice but to face it. I drove aimlessly for a while after I left the house, my mind clouded with anger and betrayal. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Heather, the woman I loved, the woman I had built my life around, had torn everything apart. And for what? For some guy who would probably disappear as soon as things got complicated? I wasn't ready to leave it like that. The anger boiling inside me was too much to handle, and I wasn't going to just walk away without getting some answers, or, at the very least, some closure. I pulled over, gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles turned white. Then, without thinking, I turned the car around and headed back to the house. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was shaking with rage. I saw the same car, the one that belonged to him, parked there again, like he had every right to be in my house. That was all it took to send me over the edge. I stormed up to the door, and without knocking, I barged in. Heather was standing in the kitchen, and there he was, casually leaning against the counter, like he was the man of the house. They both looked up as I entered, and the expression on his face turned from surprise to something else, almost like amusement. That smug, arrogant look was more than I could take. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the house. Heather stepped forward, her face pale with fear. But I wasn't looking at her. I was staring at him. "Hey man, take it easy," he said, raising his hands like I was the one out of control. His voice was calm, almost patronizing, and it only fueled my anger. "Take it easy?" I shot back, stepping closer to him. "You've been screwing my wife, and you want me to take it easy?" He shrugged, glancing at Heather as if they were in on some kind of joke. That was it. I lunged at him. My fist connected with his jaw before he had a chance to react, sending him stumbling back against the counter. Heather screamed, but I didn't care. I had been holding this rage in for too long, and now it was all pouring out. The guy recovered quickly, wiping the blood from his lip, and then he came at me. He was bigger than me, taller, stronger. But I didn't care. I wasn't thinking anymore. We grappled, crashing into the kitchen table, sending dishes flying. Heather was shouting something, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of our fists landing, the heavy breaths, the struggle. He got a good hit in, catching me across the ribs, but I didn't stop. I slammed him against the wall, grabbing his shirt with both hands. "What kind of man screws another man's wife in his own house?" I snarled, pushing him harder against the wall. He didn't answer, just gritted his teeth as he tried to push me off. I wasn't going to let him get away that easily. "Stop it, please!" Heather's voice finally cut through the chaos, and for a second I hesitated. She was crying now, her hands covering her mouth, looking at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. That hesitation was all it took. The guy shoved me back hard, and I lost my balance, falling onto the floor. He straightened his shirt, brushing himself off like nothing had happened. "Look, man," he said, catching his breath, "this isn't about you. Heather and I—" "Shut up!" I yelled, getting to my feet. "You don't get to talk about her. You don't get to act like this is normal." Heather stepped between us then, her tear-streaked face pleading with me. "Please, just stop," she said softly. This is my fault. You're both hurting each other, and it's my fault." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the guilt in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the betrayal. I felt sick, physically sick, knowing she had let this man into our life, into our home, our bed. I turned to him again, my fists clenched, ready to go another round. But he held up his hands, stepping back. "I'm leaving," he said, glancing at Heather, as if he was waiting for her to say something. She just stood there, silent, tears streaming down her face. He walked past me without another word, heading for the door. As he reached the threshold, I couldn't help myself. "If you come back here, I swear to God, you won't be walking out next time." He paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't look back. The door clicked shut behind him, and suddenly, the house felt eerily quiet. I stood there, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. Heather was still crying, but I didn't know what to say to her. What was there to say? She had made her choice, and now we were both left with the fallout. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything in this world. And now I felt nothing but emptiness. "Sorry?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "You're sorry?" She nodded, but I could tell she didn't know what else to say. Neither did I. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I can't look at you. I can't stay here, not after this." She didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked out the door. I spent the next few nights on my buddy Dave's couch. I hadn't told him everything, just that Heather and I were having problems and I needed space. Dave wasn't the type to ask questions. He gave me a beer, turned on the game, and let me sit there in silence while my mind raced. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of Heather with that guy was seared into my brain, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw it all over again. How had it come to this? How had my marriage turned into a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from? On the fourth day, just as I was thinking about whether I should get a lawyer or stay in limbo, Heather called. "Can we talk?" Her voice was shaky, and despite everything, I could hear the fear in it. "Talk about what?" I snapped, not even trying to hide my anger. "Please just come over. I need to tell you something. It's important." I didn't want to go. Every part of me wanted to hang up and pretend like she didn't exist. But there was something in her voice, something that felt different. So I agreed, against my better judgment, and drove back to the house I had once called home. The place looked the same as it always had. The roses I had left on the table were still there, wilted and dried up, a grim reminder of how far gone everything was. I stepped inside and found Heather sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I remembered. She didn't say anything at first, just stared down at her hands, wringing them nervously. I stood there waiting for her to speak, but the silence dragged on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. For a moment, I couldn't even process what she had said. I just stood there, staring at her, my mind refusing to accept it. "Pregnant?" I echoed, my voice hollow. "What do you mean, pregnant?" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. "I found out this morning. I wasn't feeling well, so I took a test. And then I went to the doctor to confirm it." I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the reality of what she was saying began to sink in. My whole world tilted on its axis. "Is it mine?" I asked, the question tearing its way out of me before I could stop it. It was the most painful thing I'd ever had to ask, but I had no choice. After everything, I couldn't just assume. Her face crumpled, and I knew the answer before she even said it. "I don't know," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It could be, but it could be his too." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The walls seemed to close in as I stood there, my hands shaking with rage and disbelief. I had been prepared for a lot of things: anger, hurt, betrayal. But this? I hadn't seen this coming. "What the hell, Heather?" I shouted, the words exploding out of me. "You've been cheating on me, and now you're pregnant, and you don't even know whose it is." "I'm sorry," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why did you sleep with him? How long has this been going on?" She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of regret. "It started a few months ago," she admitted. "I don't know why. I was lonely, I guess. We weren't connecting, and he was there. It just happened." "Just happened?" I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. "You don't just accidentally have an affair, Heather. You made a choice. And now you're pregnant and you don't even know if it's mine or his." She sobbed harder, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. I was too consumed by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me: anger, pain, confusion, and the overwhelming sense that my entire life had just been ripped apart. "I don't know what to do," she said through her tears. "I'm scared, and I know you hate me, but I don't even know what to feel right now." I cut her off, my voice trembling. "You've betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now you're telling me I might be a father or not. How am I supposed to deal with that?" She didn't have an answer. She just cried, and I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides, trying to hold back the tidal wave of emotions threatening to drown me. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure out what the hell I'm going to do." She nodded, but there was a desperation in her eyes. "Please just don't leave me," she begged. "I know I messed up, but I still love you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I looked at her, the woman I had once thought I would spend the rest of my life with, and felt nothing but numbness. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix," I said coldly. You've destroyed everything. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door. The days after Heather's bombshell passed in a blur. I didn't know what to do with myself. I went back to staying at Dave's place, barely eating, barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Every time I tried to think straight, my mind went back to that conversation. Pregnant, and the worst part, she didn't even know whose it was. I couldn't escape it. Dave didn't push me for details, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd come home from work, throw me a beer, and sit next to me in silence. It was what I needed. No judgment, no advice, just someone there. But even then, it didn't help. Nothing could. How could it, when everything I thought I knew about my life had been ripped apart in the cruelest way possible? A week went by before Heather called me again. I didn't want to answer, but I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. There were too many unanswered questions. I still didn't know what the next steps were, if I even wanted to find out. But I was tired of running, so, with a deep breath, I picked up the phone. Hey, she said, her voice shaky. I know you probably don't want to talk, but we need to figure this out. I know, I said flatly, not giving her much to work with. I wasn't in the mood to make this easy. I scheduled a paternity test, she continued, her words coming out in a rush. Once we know, we can decide what happens next. I stayed silent for a moment, processing what she had just said. A paternity test. My stomach twisted at the thought of it. This was my life now, waiting for a test to tell me if I was going to be a father, or if she had conceived with another man. The unfairness of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. I should have been excited, should have been preparing for a baby, not wondering if it was even mine. When? I finally asked, my voice strained. Next week, she hesitated. I understand if you don't want to be there. I let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, I'm not exactly eager to stand in the same room as you and wonder which one of us this baby belongs to. Her silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. She didn't have any comforting words. No way to make this better. There was no making this better. I'll be there for the test, I said, my voice cold. After that, we'll see. Okay, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I don't want to hear it, Heather, I interrupted, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. You don't get to be sorry. You made your choices. Now we both have to live with them. I hung up before she could say anything else. I wasn't in the mood to hear more apologies. I needed to clear my head, to figure out how I was going to survive the next few weeks without completely falling apart. The day of the paternity test came quicker than I expected. I drove to the clinic feeling like I was walking toward my own execution. Every mile closer, my chest tightened. I hadn't spoken to Heather since that phone call, and I wasn't sure what to expect when I saw her. She was already in the waiting room when I arrived. She looked tired, more than tired, really, like she hadn't slept in days. She stood up when she saw me, but I didn't move to greet her. There was too much distance between us now, too much damage. I couldn't even look at her the same way. We didn't say a word to each other as we sat down and waited for the nurse to call us. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with all the things that needed to be said, but never would be. When the nurse finally called us in, I felt like I was on autopilot, just going through the motions. The test itself was quick. A simple cheek swab for both of us, nothing more. But the weight of what it meant hung over me like a dark cloud. This was the moment that would define everything. Whether or not the baby was mine, whether or not my marriage, as broken as it was, had any hope of surviving. After the test was done, we walked out into the parking lot together. Heather looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice tight. I need time. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I understand. I turned and walked away, not looking back. I couldn't bear to see her cry. I couldn't bear to feel anything at all. The waiting was unbearable. Every day dragged on like a lifetime as I waited for the results. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Part of me wanted the baby to be mine, if only so that I wouldn't have to deal with the thought of her carrying his child. But another part of me was terrified of what it would mean if it was mine. Could I ever forgive her? Could I raise a child with a woman who had betrayed me in the worst possible way? I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. My thoughts kept circling back to that clinic, to Heather, to the future that I couldn't see anymore. I didn't know if we could survive this. I didn't know if I could survive this. And then, finally, the call came. I was sitting on Dave's couch, staring blankly at the TV, when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen and saw the clinic's number. My heart pounded in my chest as I answered, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. "Mr. Reynolds," the nurse said, her voice calm and professional. "I have the results of your paternity test." I squeezed the phone tighter. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated for a moment, as if giving me one last chance to prepare myself. Then she said the words that would change everything. "The test results are conclusive. You are the father of the child." I felt the world drop out from under me. The room spun, my head swimming with the weight of those words. I was going to be a father. This was my child. But the only thing I could think was that I had never felt more lost in my entire life. The words echoed in my head. You are the father of the child. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, but I couldn't hear anything else the nurse was saying. My world had just split in two. I was going to be a father. And yet it felt like I had just lost everything that mattered to me. After I hung up, I stared at the wall, the weight of reality crashing down on me. I should have been happy, excited even. This was my child. But instead, all I felt was this gaping hole where my life used to be, where my marriage used to be. How was I supposed to be a father to a child born out of betrayal? I wasn't ready to face Heather yet. Not after everything that had happened. I needed time, space, but as much as I tried to escape it, I couldn't deny the truth. I was bound to her now, through this child, and no matter what, we would have to figure out a way to make this work. The thought of seeing her again twisted my gut, but I knew I couldn't avoid it. The next step was inevitable. 2 days later, I called her. I didn't say much, just told her I'd be over later that evening to talk. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, but she didn't try to push me. She just agreed. That evening, I drove back to the house, the same house where our marriage had fallen apart. I parked outside for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. There was a child involved now, our child. When I stepped inside, Heather was sitting on the couch, just like the last time I'd seen her. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen, like she hadn't slept. She looked up at me as I walked in, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with, beneath all the hurt and betrayal. We stood there in silence for a long moment, neither of us knowing where to begin. Finally, she spoke. I got the call too," she said, her voice trembling. "I know. It's yours." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. My heart was torn in two. One part of me still loved her, still wanted the life we had dreamed of. But the other part of me was drowning in pain, anger, and betrayal. "I'm so sorry, Max," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I've said it before, but I don't know how else to tell you how much I regret everything. I wish I could take it all back." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "It doesn't work like that, Heather," I said quietly. "You can't just erase what happened. I'm here because we're having a child together, but that doesn't mean everything is fixed. You broke us." Tears welled up in her eyes and she nodded, not arguing, not defending herself. She just accepted it. "I know," she whispered. "I know I broke us." We fell into another long silence, the weight of everything we had lost hanging between us. I glanced at her, and in that moment, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. A kind of raw vulnerability that took me back to when we first met. She had been different then. Soft, full of life and hope, her laughter infectious. I remembered the nights we'd stayed up late talking, her head on my chest as she traced lazy circles on my skin, telling me she couldn't imagine her life without me. It was the kind of love you thought would never fade. I looked at her now and saw the pain, the guilt. but I also saw a flicker of that woman I had fallen in love with. We were supposed to be different, Heather, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought we had something real. I thought we'd grow old together. She broke down then, her sobs filling the room. I thought so too, she cried, her shoulders shaking. I don't know why I did what I did. I've spent every day since hating myself for it, Max. I ruined everything. I took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that were threatening to spill over. I wanted to stay angry, wanted to keep the wall between us. But seeing her like this, so broken, so full of regret, was making it harder to hold on to that anger. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said, my voice trembling, but I can't hate you either. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, hopeful, like she was searching for a way back to me. I don't expect you to forgive me, Max, she whispered, but I still love you. I never stopped loving you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to that love we once had, but I couldn't forget what she had done. Still, despite everything, some part of me still loved her too, even if I didn't want to admit it. I don't know what happens next, I said finally, but we're going to have this baby, and no matter what, I'm going to be there for my child. Heather nodded, wiping away her tears. I want to make it right, Max. I want us to be a family. I stood there staring at her, torn between the love I still felt for her and the anger that hadn't fully left me. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this would be easy. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt, the part of me that wanted to believe in second chances. Maybe, I said softly, taking a step closer to her. Maybe we can figure it out, but it's going to take time. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with hope and desperation. I'll wait, she whispered. I'll wait as long as it takes. I didn't know if we could ever get back to where we once were, but in that moment I felt something shift between us. The pain was still there, but so was the possibility of healing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. I loved you once, Heather, I said, my voice soft but firm, and part of me still does. But if we're going to do this, it has to be different this time. You have to be different. She nodded, her tears flowing again, but this time they seemed different, more like relief than sorrow. I will be, she promised, her voice trembling. I swear I'll be better. For you. For us. For our baby. I looked at her for a long moment, the weight of everything we had been through hanging between us. And then, slowly, I reached out and took her hand. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. I guess we'll see, I said quietly. For the first time in what felt like forever, we sat down together side by side, no longer enemies, no longer strangers. There was still so much to work through, so much pain to heal. But in that moment, with her hand in mine, I felt a flicker of something I thought I had lost, a glimmer of hope. The next week, I did it again. Another business trip. More clues. This time, I made sure she found a hotel key in my jacket pocket. When she confronted me, I played dumb, acted confused. But I could see the cracks forming. The same kind of cracks that had been in me when I found out about her affair. It was working. The final step came 2 weeks before her due date. I told her I was going out for the night, just to blow off some steam with the guys. But instead, I went to a bar and struck up a conversation with a woman. A stranger. She wasn't anything special, but that wasn't the point. I made sure Heather found out. I let her see the lipstick stain on my collar, let her smell the faint trace of perfume on my shirt. When I got home that night, she was sitting on the couch, tears streaming down her face. Are you cheating on me? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, my face cold, detached. Does it matter? I said, shrugging. Her sobs came in heavy waves, but I didn't feel anything. I watched her break down in front of me, and all I could think was how satisfying it was to see her like this, finally feeling a fraction of the pain she had caused me. I thought we were fixing things, she cried, clutching her pregnant belly. I thought we were going to be a family. I stared at her, my anger boiling over. You thought wrong, I said, my voice sharp. You destroyed this family the moment you spread your legs for another man. You think I was just going to forgive and forget? You think I was going to raise this kid and pretend like nothing happened? Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. "I'm done, Heather," I said, standing up. "You made your bed. Now lie in it. I'm leaving." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "You can't, you can't just leave," she whispered. "I'm pregnant with your child." I laughed bitterly. "You really think that's enough to keep me here? After everything you did, I'm done. You're on your own." I walked out the door that night, leaving her sobbing on the couch. I didn't look back. I didn't care anymore. I stayed at Dave's for a few more weeks, long enough to wait until the baby was born. Heather called me the night she went into labor, begging me to come to the hospital, but I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. The baby's birth wasn't my concern anymore. 2 days later, I got an email from her. The subject line read, "It's a girl." I didn't open it. I didn't care. I had already decided that I was done. I wasn't going to be a part of that child's life. It wasn't her fault, but she was a reminder of everything I had lost, everything Heather had destroyed. I didn't want any part of it. I filed for divorce the next day. I left her the house, the car, everything. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to be free of her, free of the life we had built together, free of the constant reminder of her betrayal. A few months later, I moved to a new city. A fresh start. I didn't tell Heather where I was going. Didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't care what happened to her or the baby. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. The last I heard, she was struggling to raise the baby on her own. She had lost her job and was living with her parents, trying to piece her life back together. I didn't care. She was out of my life, and I had no intention of ever letting her back in. In the end, I got my revenge. She had taken everything from me, and now I had taken everything from her. And as I sat in my new apartment, far away from the wreckage of our old life, I felt nothing but relief. She had abandoned me first. I just returned the favor. Months passed after I left Heather, and life had taken on a strange new rhythm. I'd moved to a new city, started over in every possible way. The apartment was small, nothing special, but it was mine. No reminders of the past, no painful memories hanging over me. I hadn't spoken to Heather since the day I filed for divorce. She hadn't even fought it. Maybe she was too broken down, or maybe she knew there was no point. I started going out more, meeting new people, trying to rebuild myself. There were a few nights with women I barely remembered, meaningless flings to dull the pain, but I wasn't looking for love, not anymore. That part of my life felt like a closed book, sealed shut after what Heather had done. But no matter how far I ran, the past had a way of creeping back in. Some nights, when everything was quiet, I'd lie in bed and think about the baby, my daughter. She was out there somewhere, growing up without me, without a father. I tried to shove the thought away, convince myself that it didn't matter, that I was better off not being in her life, that it wasn't my responsibility anymore. But the guilt was always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One night, out of nowhere, I got a message from Heather. I hadn't heard from her in months, and seeing her name on my phone screen sent a jolt through me. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was simple. No anger, no pleading, just 4 words. "She's asking about you." I stared at those words for what felt like hours. My chest tightened, and my thoughts spun in 1,000 different directions. She was talking about our daughter. Asking about me? How? She was barely a year old. There was no way she could be asking about me. Unless Heather had told her something, had shown her pictures, or... I didn't know. I didn't even know the kid's name. I put my phone down, refusing to let myself care. This was exactly what I had planned, wasn't it? To cut ties, to leave that part of my life behind. Heather had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. I wasn't going to let her reel me back in with some guilt trip. I wasn't going to be part of that child's life. Another few weeks passed, and I thought about Heather's message less and less. I threw myself into work, into the new life I was building. But one afternoon, when I was going through my mail, something caught my eye. A letter. From Heather. I tore it open, expecting some dramatic plea, some attempt to manipulate me into coming back. But what I found was worse. The letter wasn't long, but it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't full of apologies or desperate words. Instead, it was raw. honest. "Max," it began, "I know you don't want anything to do with me or our daughter, and I can't blame you. You have every right to feel the way you do, but I need you to know that I'm not doing well. I've been trying my best, but I can't afford to take care of her on my own anymore. I've lost everything. My job, the house. I'm staying with my parents, but they can't support us much longer. I didn't write this to ask for money or help. I just wanted you to know the truth. I don't expect you to come back. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I can't lie to our daughter forever. One day she'll ask about you for real, and I don't know what I'll say. Her name is Lily. She has your eyes." The rest of the letter was a blur. Those two lines stuck in my head like a knife twisting in my gut. Her name is Lily. She has your eyes. I crumpled the letter in my hands and threw it across the room, but I couldn't shake the image in my head. A little girl, my daughter, with my eyes. I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't asked for this. But now I had to live with it. And for the first time since I left, I felt something crack inside me. Something I had been trying to bury. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to have. Was I really going to let her grow up without knowing who I was? Was I going to let Heather struggle and suffer while I turned my back? She has your eyes. The words haunted me. The next morning, I found myself driving without thinking, my mind on autopilot. It wasn't until I was halfway there that I realized where I was going. Heather's parents lived about an hour away from where I had moved. I hadn't planned on going there, hadn't even decided if I would, but my hands were on the wheel and my foot was on the gas. Before I knew it, I was parked outside their house, staring at the front door. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to turn around, to leave before anyone saw me. But I couldn't. Something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't ignore. I got out of the car and walked up to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hand hovered over the doorbell, and for a moment I hesitated. What was I doing? Was this really the right thing? Before I could change my mind, I rang the bell. The door opened, and there she was. Heather. She looked thinner, more tired than I remembered. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw me, but before she could say anything, a small voice called out from behind her. "Mommy, who's that?" Heather turned, and I saw her. Lily. She stood there, gripping the edge of Heather's shirt, her big eyes staring up at me. My eyes. The world seemed to stop. My chest tightened, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hatred. I just felt something. Something I hadn't expected. Heather knelt down beside Lily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Lily, this is..." She paused, her voice catching. "This is your daddy." Lily looked up at me, her tiny face full of curiosity and innocence. "Daddy?" she whispered, the word foreign and unfamiliar on her lips. I knelt down too, feeling my heart break and heal all at once. "Yeah," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm your daddy." She stared at me for a long moment, then took a hesitant step forward. "Hi," she said, her voice shy but sweet. I smiled, my vision blurred with tears. I hadn't known I was holding back. "Hi, Lily." Heather watched us, her eyes red with tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In that moment, all the anger, all the pain, all the betrayal faded into the background, because none of that mattered now. All that mattered was her. Lily, my daughter. The one thing I never knew I needed until now.